Harry Potter sat on his narrow bed at number 4, Privet Drive, staring at the pale August sunlight filtering through his barred window. 2 weeks had passed since his 13th birthday, and the memory of Aunt Marge floating toward the ceiling like a monstrous balloon still made his stomach clench with a mixture of satisfaction and dread. Uncle Vernon had barely spoken to him since the ministry officials had deflated her and modified her memory, communicating only through furious glares and the occasional growled threat about freakish behavior. The house felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were pressing inward with each passing day. Aunt Petunia's shrill voice echoed from downstairs, berating Dudley about his diet, while Uncle Vernon's heavy footsteps thundered across the kitchen floor as he prepared for another day of drill selling. Harry had learned to recognize the rhythm of their morning routine, the way their anger seemed to thicken the air like smoke from a poorly ventilated fireplace. He'd been confined to his room for most of the past fortnight, allowed out only for bathroom breaks and the occasional grudging meal. The isolation was nothing new, but something felt different this time. Harry found himself staring at his reflection in the darkened window each night, searching for signs of the strange power that had inflated his aunt without conscious thought. The magic felt closer to the surface now, humming beneath his skin like electricity before a storm. A sharp tapping at his window jolted him from his brooding. Hedwig perched on the sill outside, her amber eyes bright with intelligence. But she wasn't alone. A large barn owl with magnificent feathers sat beside her, carrying what appeared to be several pieces of parchment tied with black ribbon. Harry's heart lifted for the first time in days as he scrambled to unlock the window. "About time you showed up, girl," he murmured, as Hedwig hooted softly and rubbed against his cheek. The larger owl extended its leg with dignified patience, and Harry noticed the parchments were sealed with what looked like an official crest, a shield bearing a constellation of stars. The first letter felt heavier than ordinary parchment, almost warm to the touch. Harry's name was written across it in elegant handwriting that somehow reminded him of autumn leaves. He broke the black wax seal carefully and unfolded the letter, his eyes widening as he read. "My dear Harry, you don't know me, but I know you better than you might think. My name is Sirius Black, and I am your godfather. I realize this news may come as a shock, particularly given what you may have heard about my recent escape from Azkaban prison. I need you to understand, before anything else, that I am innocent of the crimes for which I was imprisoned." Harry's hands trembled as he continued reading, the words seeming to burn themselves into his memory. "I was never given a trial, Harry. I was thrown into Azkaban based on circumstantial evidence and the word of the real traitor, Peter Pettigrew, who faked his own death and has been hiding as a rat for the past 12 years. I escaped not to harm you, as the ministry believes, but to protect you from the truth they've been hiding. Your parents named me your magical guardian in their will. When they died, I should have taken you in, raised you, told you about the wizarding world and your heritage. Instead, Albus Dumbledore placed you with your mother's muggle relatives without consulting that will, and I was arrested before I could claim my rights as your guardian. I am writing to you now, because I can no longer bear the thought of you suffering in ignorance while I remain powerless to help you. Along with this letter, you will find documents that will change your life forever. I am formally transferring to you my inheritance as the last heir of the most ancient and noble house of Black. This inheritance comes with considerable responsibility, but also with power that you can use to seek truth and justice. The ring enclosed with these documents will activate when you put it on. Do not fear what you see. The visions are memories preserved by Black family magic, and they will show you proof of my innocence. More importantly, They will show you that you have never been as powerless as others have led you to believe. Be brave, Harry. Your parents would be so proud of the young man you've become, despite everything you've endured. With love and hope, Padfoot, Sirius Black. Your godfather Harry read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. A godfather. He had a godfather who was alive, who cared about him, who wanted to help him. The relief was so overwhelming, it made his chest ache. But alongside the joy came confusion and anger. If this was true, then why had no one told him? Why had Dumbledore placed him with the Dursleys when he had a magical guardian who wanted him? With shaking fingers, he opened the second piece of parchment, which bore an official-looking header. Gringotts Wizarding Bank. Inheritance documentation. The text was dense with legal terminology, but certain phrases leapt out at him. Hereby transfer all rights, properties and titles associated with the House of Black, and including hereditary seat on the Wizengamot, and full magical emancipation upon acceptance of lordship. The third document appeared to be a copy of his parents' will, one he'd never seen before. His throat tightened as he read their words, written in his father's familiar handwriting. Should we both perish, custody of our son, Harry James Potter, shall pass to his godfather, Sirius Black, whom we trust above all others to raise Harry with love and teach him of his magical heritage. A small velvet pouch had been tied to the documents with the same black ribbon. Harry's hands trembled as he opened it, revealing a ring unlike anything he'd ever seen. The band appeared to be made of white gold, etched with tiny stars that seemed to shimmer and move in the light. The face of the ring bore the same constellation crest he'd seen on the letter's seal, but the stars were set with what looked like actual diamonds that caught the August sunlight and threw it back in brilliant sparks. Harry slipped the ring onto his right ring finger, surprised to find it fit perfectly despite his thin hands. The moment the metal touched his skin, the world exploded into visions. He was no longer in his bedroom at Privet Drive. Instead, he stood in what appeared to be a cozy living room with a crackling fireplace, watching a younger version of his father laugh at something a man with shoulder-length black hair had just said. The man, Sirius, Harry realized with a jolt, looked carefree and happy, nothing like the gaunt prisoner he'd seen in newspaper photographs. You know James would want you to be the one, his mother's voice said, and Harry spun to see her sitting in an armchair, her hands resting on her pregnant belly. She was beautiful, more beautiful than any photograph could capture, and her green eyes, so like his own, sparkled with warmth and trust. If anything happens to us, Sirius, promise me you'll tell Harry everything. Don't let them hide who he is. Sirius knelt beside her chair, his face serious now. I promise, Lily. I'll make sure he knows he's loved, that he's not alone. I'll teach him about James's family, about magic, about everything they'll need to know to make his own choices. The vision shifted, and Harry found himself in a dark, damp cell. Sirius sat hunched against a stone wall, older now, his face hollow with grief and rage. I didn't betray them, he whispered to the darkness. It was Peter. It was always Peter. And now Harry's with those people, those awful people who hate magic, who'll never understand what he is. His voice broke. I failed you, James. I failed you both. Another shift, and Harry watched in horror as a plump man with watery eyes and a pointed nose cowered before a younger version of Voldemort. I had to, Peter Pettigrew sobbed. They suspected me. I had to give them something, Master. You gave them Potter, Voldemort said, his red eyes glowing with satisfaction, and you let Black take the blame. Clever, Peter. Very clever indeed. The visions faded, leaving Harry gasping on his bed, the ring still warm on his finger. The truth crashed over him like a wave. Sirius was innocent. He was innocent, and he'd been rotting in Azkaban for 12 years, while the real traitor lived free. More than that, Harry had family. Real family who wanted him, who loved him, who had been kept from him by choices made by others. But with the truth came something else, a burning realization that he wasn't powerless anymore. The documents mentioned a Wizengamot seat. Harry didn't know exactly what that meant, but he knew the Wizengamot was the wizarding government's highest court. If he had a seat there, if he had the legal standing that came with being Lord Black, then perhaps he could demand answers. Perhaps he could make sure the truth came out. Harry stood up, feeling taller somehow, as if the ring had done more than just show him visions. For the first time in his life, he possessed something more powerful than accidental magic triggered by anger or fear. He possessed legal authority, political standing, and most importantly, he possessed the truth. The sound of Uncle Vernon's voice bellowing from downstairs no longer made him flinch. The bars on his window no longer seemed like an insurmountable prison. Harry Potter was no longer just an unwanted nephew locked in a cupboard-sized bedroom. He was Lord Black, and he was going to use that power to make sure everyone, from Dumbledore to the minister himself, answered for what they had done. The war for truth was about to begin, and Harry finally had weapons with which to fight it. Harry stared at the inheritance documents spread across his narrow bed, his mind racing with possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. The Black family ring felt warm against his finger, as if it were alive and responding to his thoughts. For the first time in his life, he had something more valuable than his Hogwarts letter. He had legal standing in the wizarding world. The sound of Uncle Vernon's heavy footsteps on the stairs made his decision for him. Harry hastily gathered the documents, shoving them into his school trunk along with his few possessions. He couldn't stay here, not when he had somewhere else to go, someone who wanted him. Not when he had questions that needed answers and the power to demand them. As Uncle Vernon's voice boomed from the hallway, something about that boy and locked up until September, Harry felt the now familiar tingle of magic beneath his skin. But this time, it felt different. Stronger. More controlled. The ring seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, and suddenly the air around him shimmered like heat waves rising from summer pavement. "I need to get to Diagon Alley," he whispered to the empty room, his hand instinctively touching the ring. "I need to get to Gringotts." The magic that surged through him wasn't the wild, uncontrolled burst that had inflated Aunt Marge. This felt ancient, purposeful, like a river that had been waiting 13 years to finally flow in the right direction. The barred window dissolved before his eyes, not broken but simply gone, as if it had never existed. His trunk rose smoothly into the air, floating as gently as a feather on a breeze. Harry stepped through the space where his window had been, expecting to fall 2 stories to the ground. Instead, he found himself standing on solid air, his trunk floating beside him like an obedient pet. The magic carried him forward, away from Privet Drive, away from the Dursleys, toward the hidden entrance to the leaky cauldron that his newfound knowledge somehow knew how to find. 20 minutes later, Harry walked through the brick archway into Diagon Alley, his trunk now reduced to pocket size by a charm that had come as naturally as breathing. The cobblestone street bustled with its usual morning crowd, but something was different. Witches and wizards who had barely noticed him during his previous visits now inclined their heads respectfully as he passed. A few even murmured, "Lord Black," under their breath, word of his inheritance apparently travelling fast through the wizarding rumour mill. The recognition felt strange, part thrilling, part terrifying. Harry had spent 13 years being nobody, being unwanted. Now strangers were showing him deference based on a name and title he'd learned existed only an hour ago. He pulled his shoulders back and walked purposefully toward the gleaming white marble building at the end of the street. Gringotts looked the same as it always had. Imposing, ancient, carved with warnings about thieves and fools. But as Harry approached the bronze doors, he noticed details he'd missed before. The goblin guard's eyes tracked his movement with interest rather than indifference. Their armor bore symbols that matched the constellation on his ring. One of them actually nodded to him as he passed. The banking hall's marble floor echoed with his footsteps as Harry approached the nearest available teller, a goblin with particularly sharp teeth and calculating eyes. His nameplate read, Griphook. "I need to speak with someone about the Black family inheritance," Harry said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. Griphook's black eyes fixed on the ring adorning Harry's finger, and his expression shifted from bored professionalism to keen attention. "Lord Black, we have been expecting you." He gestured to another goblin. "Ragnarok will handle my current clients. Please follow me." Harry found himself being led through corridors he'd never seen before, past doors marked with symbols and runes that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Griphook's office was smaller than Harry had expected, but richly appointed, with ledgers bound in what looked like dragon hide lining the walls. "Tea?" Griphook asked, settling behind his desk with the careful grace of a predator. "Please," Harry replied, taking the offered seat. The chair was clearly designed for someone taller, but it adjusted itself to fit him the moment he sat down. Griphook poured 2 cups of tea from a silver service, his movements precise and deliberate. "The Black inheritance is substantial, Lord Black, both in terms of wealth and responsibility. Your godfather's letter was quite clear about his intentions, but I suspect you have questions about the practical implications." "I know I have a seat on the Wizengamot," Harry began carefully, "but I don't really understand what that means." "The Wizengamot is our government's highest court and primary legislative body," Griphook explained, his tone taking on the patient quality of a teacher addressing a promising student. "Members hold hereditary seats passed down through ancient bloodlines. The Black seat has been held by your family for over 6 centuries. Harry's teacup rattled slightly as he set it down. 6 centuries. "The most ancient and noble house of Black is one of the 28 sacred bloodlines. Lord Black, your ancestor Phineas Nigellus Black served as chief warlock in the 1700s. The family has wielded considerable political influence for generations." Griphook leaned forward, his expression growing more intense. "But what you may not realize is the extent of the powers that come with your seat." "What kind of powers?" "As a hereditary member, you have the right to call emergency sessions of the Wizengamot. You can issue subpoenas compelling testimony from any witch or wizard in Britain. You can demand investigations into ministry conduct. You can even challenge the fitness of sitting officials, including the chief warlock himself." Harry's hand unconsciously moved to touch his ring. "Challenge officials?" "A formal vote of no confidence, backed by evidence and proper legal procedure." Griphook's teeth gleamed in the lamplight. "It hasn't been done in over a century, but the precedent exists. The Black family helped establish these procedures precisely to prevent the concentration of power in the hands of those who might abuse it." The implications crashed over Harry like a wave. He thought of Dumbledore, placing him with the Dursleys against his parents' wishes. Of Sirius rotting in Azkaban without a trial. Of all the times adults had made decisions about his life without consulting him or even telling him the truth. "What would I need to do?" Harry asked quietly. "Evidence, witnesses, a formal presentation before the full Wizengamot." Griphook pulled a leather-bound tome from his desk drawer. "But first, you should understand the full scope of what you've inherited. The Black family vault contains more than gold, Lord Black. It contains records." Harry's breath caught. "What kind of records?" "Your predecessors were meticulous in their documentation of ministry activities. Voting records, private correspondences, evidence of corruption or malfeasance. The Black family made it their business to know where the bodies were buried, so to speak. Griphook opened the tome, revealing page after page of detailed entries. Much of it is centuries old, but some documents date to more recent decades. Recent enough to be relevant, recent enough to be devastating, if properly presented. Griphook closed the book with a soft thud. "Would you like to see the vault, Lord Black?" The cart ride to the Black family vault felt different from Harry's previous trips to his parents' vault. Deeper, longer, through passages that seemed to pulse with ancient magic. When they finally stopped, Harry found himself before a door unlike any he'd ever seen. Black marble carved with moving constellations that tracked their progress across its surface. "Your ring, Lord Black," Griphook said simply. Harry pressed his hand against the door, and the constellations blazed with silver light before the massive portal swung silently open. The vault beyond was less a room than a cathedral. Piles of gold coins rose like small mountains, but they were almost secondary to the shelves upon shelves of documents, artifacts, and most surprisingly, portraits. One in particular caught Harry's attention, a young man with dark hair and the same green eyes he saw in his own reflection. "Uncle Regulus," the portrait said, his painted eyes focusing on Harry with obvious recognition. "You look just like your mother, though I see you're wearing father's ring now." Harry approached the portrait carefully. "You're Regulus Black, Sirius's brother." Was. The distinction becomes blurred when one exists as pigment and enchantment. Regulus smiled sadly. "Sirius contacted me through the family magic shortly before his escape. He told me what he was planning. I've been waiting for you. Is it true? About Sirius being innocent?" "Every word. I knew Peter Pettigrew was a coward and a turncoat. I tried to warn James and Lily, but—" Regulus shook his head. "I was already dying, already committed to my own path against the Dark Lord. I couldn't protect them, but I can help you now." "How?" "The documents behind you contain correspondence between Albus Dumbledore and various ministry officials regarding your placement. Letters discussing the necessity of keeping you with your Muggle relatives despite multiple offers from magical families to take you in. Records of complaints about your treatment that were deliberately ignored or buried." Harry turned to look where Regulus was indicating, and sure enough, a section of shelving bore a label, reading, "Potter Black Guardianship Correspondence, 1981 to 1993. "He knew," Harry said, the words coming out as barely a whisper. "Dumbledore knew how they treated me, and he left me there anyway. Knowledge is power, nephew, but only if you're willing to use it." Regulus leaned forward in his frame. "The question is, are you brave enough to challenge not just a man, but the legend that surrounds him?" Harry looked around the vault, at the gold that represented 6 centuries of Black family influence, at the documents that contained the evidence he needed, at the portrait of an uncle he'd never known who was offering him the tools for justice. When he looked back at Regulus, his voice was steady and sure. "Set up the meeting with Griphook about calling an emergency Wizengamot session. I want to know exactly how to issue subpoenas." Harry's hand closed around his ring, feeling the power thrumming through it. It's time people answered for what they've done. The war for truth was about to begin in earnest, and Harry Potter, Lord Black, finally had an army. The leaky cauldron felt different when Tom the innkeeper personally escorted Harry to the finest room on the 2nd floor, bowing so deeply his bald head nearly brushed his knees. The chamber was 3 times the size of Harry's room at Privet Drive, with a 4-poster bed draped in deep green velvet, a writing desk carved from what looked like ancient oak, and most importantly, floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with leather-bound volumes. "Compliments of the house, Lord Black," Tom had said, his voice carrying the kind of reverence usually reserved for celebrities or royalty. "These are the legal archives, records kept by your predecessors dating back 2 centuries. The Black family has always maintained a private library here for research purposes. Harry ran his fingers along the spines of the books, reading titles like Wizengamot Procedures and Precedents, Guardian Rights in Magical Law, and Constitutional Powers of Ancient Houses. Just yesterday, he would have been intimidated by such imposing tomes. Now they felt like weapons waiting to be wielded. He pulled down a volume titled Legal Requirements for Minor Placement and settled into the high-backed chair at the writing desk. The book fell open to a chapter on magical guardian protocols, and Harry's eyes widened as he read the dense legal text. Any placement of a magical minor with non-magical guardians requires explicit written consent from the child's designated magical guardian, as specified in the parent's will. In cases where no magical guardian is named, approval must be obtained from the Wizengamot's Child Welfare Committee before placement can proceed. Failure to follow these procedures renders the placement legally void and subjects the responsible parties to charges of child endangerment. Harry's quill scratched furiously across a piece of parchment as he took notes. Dumbledore had placed him with the Dursleys without consulting Sirius, Harry's named magical guardian. According to wizarding law, his entire childhood had been one long illegal detention. The anger that surged through him was different from the wild rage that had inflated Aunt Marge. This was cold, focused fury, the kind that demanded justice rather than revenge. Harry reached for another volume, this one focusing on Wizengamot procedures for challenging official misconduct. Hours passed as Harry immersed himself in the intricacies of wizarding law. He learned about the formal language required for subpoenas, the procedures for calling emergency sessions, and most importantly, the precedents for questioning sitting members of the Wizengamot about their votes and decisions. The case of Blackwood versus the Chief Warlock, 1847, established that any hereditary member may demand testimony from fellow Wizengamot members regarding decisions affecting magical families under their protection. Harry made careful notes about the Blackwood precedent, his handwriting growing more confident with each page. The Black family ring seemed to pulse with approval as he worked, and occasionally he found himself understanding legal concepts that should have been beyond his 13-year-old comprehension. The family magic was helping him, he realized, centuries of Black legal knowledge flowing through the ring into his mind. By evening, Harry had drafted 3 formal subpoenas. His hand moved across the parchment with surprising grace, forming the archaic legal phrases that would compel testimony from the 3 people who knew the most about his illegal placement. To Professor Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, you are hereby commanded to appear before an emergency session of the Wizengamot to provide testimony regarding your knowledge of and participation in the placement of Harry James Potter with non-magical guardians in violation of wizarding law. Writing McGonagall's name had been particularly difficult. She was the closest thing he'd had to a caring adult authority figure at Hogwarts, and the thought of forcing her to testify against Dumbledore made his stomach clench with guilt. But the law was the law, and Harry had learned today that good intentions were no excuse for legal violations. The subpoena for Hagrid was equally painful to write. The gentle half-giant had been the first person to show Harry kindness in the wizarding world, but he had also been the one to deliver Harry to Privet Drive as an infant. If Hagrid had knowledge of alternative arrangements or objections that had been ignored, Harry needed that testimony. The third subpoena, for Albus Dumbledore himself, filled 3 full pages. Harry detailed every legal violation he'd uncovered, every procedure that had been ignored, every precedent that made Dumbledore's actions not just questionable but criminal under wizarding law. A tapping at his window interrupted his work. Harry looked up to see Hedwig perched outside, along with an unfamiliar, tawny owl. He opened the window and took the letter the visiting owl offered, recognizing Hermione's neat handwriting immediately. Dear Harry, I hope this finds you well, though from what I'm hearing through the magical grapevine, well, might be an understatement. Mrs. Weasley's cousin works at Gringotts, and apparently the entire banking system is abuzz about the new Lord Black, who happens to be someone called Harry Potter. I must admit I'm rather confused. When exactly did you become a lord? And why haven't you answered any of my previous letters? I've been writing to you at Privet Drive for weeks, but Hedwig keeps returning with the letters undelivered. The Daily Prophet is reporting that there's going to be some kind of emergency Wizengamot session, though they're being frustratingly vague about the details. Please tell me this has something to do with you finally getting away from those awful relatives of yours. I'm dying to hear what's really happening. Ron's family is being surprisingly tight-lipped, which usually means something big is going on. Love, Hermione P.S. If you really are Lord Black now, does this mean you can finally tell those Dursley people exactly what you think of them? Harry smiled despite himself at Hermione's postscript, but the smile faded as he considered his response. How could he explain everything that had happened without revealing information that might compromise his legal strategy? The fewer people who knew his exact plans, the better. He pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and began to write. Dear Hermione, you're right about me becoming Lord Black. It's a long story involving my godfather and some family inheritance issues I never knew about. I can't go into all the details right now, legal reasons. But yes, I'm finally away from the Dursleys for good. The Wizengamot session is related to some irregularities in how certain decisions were made about my guardianship after my parents died. I'm working with some very knowledgeable legal advisors to make sure the proper procedures are followed this time. I know this all sounds mysterious, but I promise I'll explain everything once it's safe to do so. For now, please don't worry. For the first time in my life, I actually have some control over what happens to me. Give my regards to your parents. Harry P.S. I did tell the Dursleys exactly what I thought of them. The look on Uncle Vernon's face when I walked through a magically dissolved window was worth 13 years of their nonsense. Harry sealed the letter and gave it to Hedwig, who hooted softly and nuzzled his cheek before flying off into the London night. Alone again, Harry returned to his legal preparations. He had one more crucial task to complete, mastering the formal speech patterns required for Wizengamot presentations. The books made it clear that improper language or protocol could invalidate even the strongest legal arguments. Harry spent the next hour practicing phrases from a volume on proper address in Wizengamot proceedings. Honourable members of the Wizengamot, I call upon you to hear testimony regarding violations of our most sacred laws. With respect to the Chief Warlock, I must challenge the legality of decisions made without proper consultation. The evidence will show that established procedures were deliberately circumvented. The words felt strange in his mouth at first, too formal, too grown up for someone who still sometimes forgot to duck under low door frames. But as he practiced, the language began to feel natural, as if the Black family magic were teaching him not just the words, but the confidence to speak them with authority. By midnight, Harry's desk was covered with notes, drafted subpoenas, and legal precedents. His head buzzed with new knowledge about guardian rights, procedural requirements, and constitutional powers he'd never dreamed he possessed. Tomorrow, he would send the subpoenas. Tomorrow, he would formally request an emergency Wizengamot session. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of holding Albus Dumbledore accountable for 13 years of illegal decisions. But tonight, for the first time since he could remember, Harry Potter fell asleep, not as an unwanted burden hidden away in a cupboard, but as Lord Black, a young man with the power to demand truth and the legal knowledge to get it. The books on his desk seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, centuries of Black family wisdom standing ready to support their newest heir in his quest for justice. Outside his window, London's lights twinkled like stars, and Harry dreamed of a courtroom where truth mattered more than reputation, and where a 13-year-old lord could make the most powerful wizard in Britain answer for his crimes. Harry's hands trembled only slightly as he sealed the fourth and final envelope, this one addressed to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Inside lay his formal request for an emergency session of the Wizengamot, written in the archaic language he'd spent 3 days mastering. The parchment bore the Black family seal pressed into dark green wax, a constellation of stars that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. He'd sent the subpoenas by Ministry Owl that morning, each one carrying the weight of 6 centuries of Black family authority. Now came the hardest part, waiting for the wizarding world to respond to the unprecedented sight of a 13-year-old lord demanding justice from the most powerful figures in their society. The formal request felt heavier in his hands than it should have, as if the parchment itself understood the magnitude of what Harry was attempting. According to the legal texts, no one had invoked the ancient emergency session provisions in over 40 years, and never had they been used by someone so young. To the Honourable Head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, I, Harry James Potter, Lord Black of the most ancient and noble House of Black, hereby invoke my hereditary right to call an emergency session of the Wizengamot to address violations of our most fundamental laws regarding the protection of magical children. Harry had rewritten the request 7 times before the language felt right, formal enough to command respect, but clear enough to leave no doubt about his intentions. He gave the letter to a ministry owl, one of the large barn owls that specialized in official correspondence, and watched until it disappeared into the London sky. 3 hours later, an owl arrived, bearing the seal of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Amelia Bones sat in her office at the ministry, staring at the most extraordinary piece of correspondence she'd received in 23 years of magical law enforcement. The request itself was legally sound. She'd checked the precedents twice, but the implications were staggering. Lord Black. She remembered when Sirius Black had been dragged off to Azkaban, remembered the whispered conversations about his lack of trial. At the time, she'd been a junior prosecutor, too low in the hierarchy to question Barty Crouch's handling of the case. Now, his alleged heir, a boy she knew to be Harry Potter, was demanding explanations that half the ministry had spent 12 years avoiding. Her assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission, his face pale with excitement and worry. "Madam Bones, there's been a development regarding the Black request." "What kind of development?" "The subpoenas have been delivered. All of them." Her assistant consulted his notes with shaking hands. "Professor Dumbledore, Professor McGonagall, Hagrid Rubeus, and one Mrs. Arabella Figg. The recipients are not pleased." Amelia leaned back in her chair, feeling the first stirrings of something that might have been admiration for the young lord's audacity. "I imagine they're not. Any word from the Chief Warlock himself?" "Professor Dumbledore requested an immediate private meeting with you. Something about discussing this misunderstanding before it goes too far." "Did he now?" Amelia smiled grimly. "Tell Professor Dumbledore that all emergency session requests are matters of public record and will be handled through proper channels. If he wishes to discuss the accusations against him, he is welcome to do so during his testimony." Meanwhile, in his office at Hogwarts, Albus Dumbledore sat in stunned silence. The official subpoena spread across his desk like an accusation written in fire. His hands, usually steady despite his advanced age, shook slightly as he reread the formal charges. Unlawful placement of a magical minor with non-magical guardians without consent from designated magical guardian, willful disregard of established protection protocols, abuse of authority in matters of child welfare. Harry. Sweet, trusting Harry, who had looked at him with such gratitude and respect just months ago. How had the boy learned so much about wizarding law so quickly? And more importantly, how had he discovered the truth about Sirius Black's innocence? A sharp knock at his door interrupted his brooding. Minerva McGonagall entered without waiting for permission, her own subpoena clutched in her white-knuckled fist. "Albus, what in Merlin's name is this about?" Her voice carried an edge he'd rarely heard in all their years of friendship. "Harry Potter is calling for an emergency Wizengamot session? He's accusing us of child endangerment?" It would appear, Minerva, that young Harry has learned some uncomfortable truths about his upbringing. Dumbledore gestured to a chair, but McGonagall remained standing, her posture rigid with controlled anger. What truths, Albus? The subpoena mentions Sirius Black's innocence as established fact. How could Harry know anything about? She stopped, her face draining of colour as the implications hit her. Oh no. Oh, Albus, tell me you haven't. Sirius Black escaped from Azkaban 3 weeks ago, Minerva. It appears he has contacted his godson. His godson. McGonagall's voice was deadly quiet. His legal magical guardian, as specified in James and Lily's will. The will you told me was lost. Dumbledore said nothing, which was answer enough. 13 years, Albus. 13 years I've watched that boy suffer with those horrible relatives, and you told me it was necessary. You said there was no other option. Her voice cracked with the weight of suppressed guilt. How long have you known Sirius was innocent? Minerva, you must understand. How long? The silence stretched between them until finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Dumbledore answered. I began to suspect the truth shortly after the trials ended. Peter's death seemed convenient. Too convenient. McGonagall's sharp intake of breath echoed in the quiet office. You suspected. You suspected, and you left an innocent man in Azkaban while placing Harry with people who... She couldn't finish the sentence. I believed it was for the greater good. Don't! McGonagall's word cut through his explanation like a blade. Don't you dare speak to me about the greater good. Not when that boy has been writing letters to his classmates about how excited he is to finally have some control over his own life. Down in London, Rita Skeeter's quill practically hummed with excitement as she scribbled notes in the margins of her copy of the subpoenas, acquired through means she preferred not to disclose. The story had everything. Scandal, corruption, a wrongfully imprisoned man, and most delicious of all, a 13-year-old boy challenging the most respected wizard in Britain. Boy who lived declares war on Dumbledore, she wrote in her notes. Sources close to Lord Black reveal shocking allegations of child abuse cover-up. Ministry insiders question whether beloved headmaster has been manipulating the chosen one since birth. Could the light's greatest champion actually be its greatest villain? This would be front-page material for weeks, possibly months. Rita could already see the galleons piling up from the exclusive interviews, the tell-all books, the international syndication rights. She'd need to move quickly to stay ahead of the other reporters who would inevitably catch wind of the story. Her quill paused over the parchment as she considered her angle. The boy himself would be the prize interview, of course, but he'd likely refuse to speak to the press. However, there were other sources, disgruntled ministry employees, former order members who might have harbored doubts, anyone with a grudge against Dumbledore or knowledge of the Black family's political connections. At the ministry, Minister Cornelius Fudge paced his office like a caged animal, occasionally pausing to glare at the emergency session request lying on his desk. A 13-year-old was about to drag the most respected wizard in Britain through a public legal proceeding that could destroy both their careers. How bad is this, Dolores? He asked his senior undersecretary, who sat primly in the corner, reviewing legal precedents. Potentially catastrophic, Dolores Umbridge replied in her sickeningly sweet voice. Lord Black's request is legally unassailable. As a hereditary member of the Wizengamot, he has every right to call for emergency sessions, and if even half these allegations prove true. If they prove true, we're looking at the biggest political scandal in a century. Fudge slumped into his chair, already imagining the headlines. Can we delay it? Find some procedural excuse? Not without risking contempt charges against the entire ministry. The Black family's emergency session rights are enshrined in the foundation documents of our government. To deny them would be grounds for a constitutional crisis. Fudge groaned and reached for his bottle of antacid. When is the earliest we can schedule it? 1 week from today, September 10th. It will give the accused time to prepare their defenses, and us time to manage the public relations disaster. Back at the leaky cauldron, Harry sat at his writing desk, composing carefully worded letters to his friends. He'd promised explanations once it was safe, but for now, he could only offer limited truth. Dear Ron, I know you must be hearing strange things about me becoming Lord Black. It's all true, but I can't explain the details until after September 10th. There's going to be a Wizengamot session that will hopefully clear up a lot of confusion about my guardianship situation. Please don't worry about me. I'm safe. I'm finally away from the Dursleys for good, and for the first time in my life, I'm able to stand up for myself properly. I'll tell you everything once it's over. See you at Hogwarts, assuming I'm still welcome there after all this. Harry. The letter to Hermione was more difficult. Her analytical mind would want to understand the legal intricacies, but Harry couldn't risk revealing his strategy before the session. Dear Hermione, you asked about the emergency Wizengamot session. All I can tell you is that it involves some serious violations of wizarding law regarding my placement with the Dursleys after my parents died. I've discovered that there were legal procedures that should have been followed, but weren't. I know you'll want to research everything about Wizengamot procedures and precedents, but please be careful what you say or write about this. There are people who might try to use any information they can get to interfere with the proceedings. I promise I'll explain everything after September 10th. Harry. As he sealed the letters, Harry felt the weight of the past week settling on his shoulders. In 7 days, he would stand before the most powerful figures in the wizarding world and demand they answer for their treatment of an orphaned child. The scared boy who had lived in a cupboard felt very far away, but the memory of those years of helpless anger gave him strength. The war for truth was no longer coming. It had begun the moment he sealed his first subpoena, and Harry Potter, Lord Black, intended to win it. The letter from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement arrived during Harry's breakfast at the Leaky Cauldron, carried by an official ministry owl whose stern expression somehow managed to convey the gravity of its message. Inside, written on heavy parchment bearing Amelia Bones's personal seal, was a request that made Harry's stomach flutter with nervous anticipation. Lord Black, your request for an emergency Wizengamot session has been approved and scheduled for September 10th, 1993 at 10 a.m. As head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, I would appreciate the opportunity to meet with you privately before the proceedings to ensure all proper protocols are observed. Would you be available tomorrow at 2 p.m. at my office in the Ministry? I believe we have much to discuss regarding the nature of your allegations and the procedures that will govern the session. Respectfully, Amelia Susan Bones Head, Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Harry read the letter twice, his mind racing with the implications. This wasn't just a polite inquiry, it was the first official acknowledgement from the Ministry that they were taking his accusations seriously. The weight of that recognition settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. The next afternoon, Harry stood in the Ministry's main atrium, wearing the most formal robes he'd been able to purchase on Diagon Alley. The Black family ring gleamed on his finger, drawing curious glances from Ministry workers who whispered behind their hands as he passed. The lift to level 2 seemed to take forever, each floor bringing him closer to what felt like the most important conversation of his life. Amelia Bones's office was exactly what Harry had expected from the formidable witch, organized, efficient, and lined with legal texts that looked well used rather than decorative. She rose from her desk as he entered, extending a firm handshake that spoke of mutual respect rather than the condescension he'd grown used to from most adults. Lord Black, thank you for coming. Her voice was crisp but not unkind, and her eyes, a sharp blue that missed nothing, studied his face with professional intensity. Please, sit. Can I offer you tea? Thank you, Madam Bones. Harry settled into the chair across from her desk, grateful that it didn't adjust itself this time. He needed to feel in control, adult, equal to the woman across from him. "I'll be direct with you, Lord Black," she began, pouring 2 cups of tea with practiced efficiency. "Your allegations against Professor Dumbledore are serious. Constitutional violations, child endangerment, abuse of authority. These aren't charges we take lightly, regardless of who makes them." "I wouldn't make them if I couldn't prove them," Harry replied, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. "I believe you wouldn't." She leaned back in her chair, studying him with those penetrating eyes. "But I need to understand why you're doing this. Revenge? Anger? Or something else?" Harry considered the question carefully, feeling the weight of centuries of Black family political wisdom flowing through his ring. "Justice, Madam Bones. For 13 years, I was placed with people who hated magic, who tried to suppress what I am, who made me believe I was worthless. All of that was illegal under wizarding law, and it was done by the people who were supposed to protect me. And your godfather, how does Sirius Black factor into your decision? He's innocent." Harry's voice carried absolute certainty. "He was thrown into Azkaban without a trial while the real traitor went free. If the system failed him that badly, how many others have been destroyed by people who thought they knew better than the law?" Amelia's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You sound older than 13, Lord Black." "I feel older than 13. Harry met her gaze steadily. "But I'm not asking for special treatment because of my age. I'm asking for the law to be followed, the way it should have been from the beginning. The Wizengamot session will be unlike anything you've experienced. The pressure, the political maneuvering, the attempts to discredit you. Are you prepared for that?" Harry thought of the Dursleys' years of cruelty, of the isolation and fear that had defined his childhood. "I've survived worse than politics, Madam Bones." She nodded slowly, and Harry caught something that might have been approval in her expression. "Very well. I wanted to ensure you understood what you were facing. The session is scheduled for September 10th. I trust you'll be ready." "I'll be ready." 2 days later, Harry was reviewing legal precedents in his room when Tom knocked on his door, his expression troubled. "Begging your pardon, Lord Black, but there's a gentleman downstairs asking to see you. Says his name is Malfoy." Harry's stomach clenched, but he kept his expression neutral. "Show him up to the private parlour, Tom. And thank you for the warning." Lucius Malfoy entered the small parlour with the fluid grace of a predator, his expensive robes and walking stick creating an aura of wealth and power that would have intimidated Harry just a month ago. Now, with the Black family ring warm on his finger, Harry felt more like he was meeting an equal. A dangerous one, but an equal nonetheless. Lord Black. Malfoy inclined his head in a gesture that managed to convey respect while maintaining his own dignity. "How good to finally meet you properly. I knew your father, you know, a fine wizard, despite his unfortunate choice in friends. Mr. Malfoy." Harry remained seated, a subtle power play he'd learned from the legal texts. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Malfoy's smile was sharp as a blade. "I believe we may have common interests regarding the upcoming Wizengamot session. Professor Dumbledore has made many decisions over the years that some of us have questioned. Perhaps we might discuss how your noble efforts could be supported by those who share your concerns about his judgment." Harry studied the man's face, noting the calculation behind the courteous words. "I appreciate your interest, Mr. Malfoy, but my concerns are about legal violations, not political disagreements. I'm not looking for allies who oppose Professor Dumbledore for their own reasons." How refreshingly naive. Malfoy's tone remained pleasant, but his eyes hardened. "The Wizengamot is a political body, Lord Black. Legal violations are just another form of political ammunition. Surely you understand that." "I understand that justice shouldn't be a political game." Harry stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "Thank you for your visit, Mr. Malfoy. But I'll be presenting my case based on evidence and law, nothing more." Malfoy's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his pale eyes. "Of course, Lord Black. How admirable. I do hope you won't find the political realities of the Wizengamot too educational." After Malfoy left, Harry slumped in his chair, feeling drained by the encounter. The man's words had carried threats wrapped in silk, promises of consequences for refusing to play the game by established rules. But Harry had meant what he said. He wouldn't compromise his pursuit of justice by allying himself with people who wanted to use it for their own ends. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Another visitor, Lord Black," Tom said apologetically. "Says she's family." This time, the woman who entered the parlour was nothing like Malfoy. Andromeda Tonks was perhaps 50, with kind brown eyes and hair that showed traces of the Black family's aristocratic features, softened by genuine warmth. She moved with quiet dignity, and Harry felt an immediate sense of kinship that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with recognition. "Harry," her voice was gentle but strong, "I'm Andromeda Tonks, your godfather's cousin. I wanted to meet you before everything becomes public." "Mrs. Tonks." Harry stood and offered his hand, which she took in both of hers. "Thank you for coming. I wanted you to know that you have family support. Not all of us agree with every Black family tradition, but we understand the importance of what you're doing." She settled into the chair Malfoy had vacated, somehow making it feel warm again. "Sirius wrote to me through family channels. He's proud of you, and so am I." "You believe he's innocent?" "I've always believed it. Sirius was many things, reckless, stubborn, sometimes infuriatingly noble, but never a traitor, and certainly never a child killer." Her expression darkened. "What was done to him, and to you, was a travesty that needed addressing years ago." They talked for nearly an hour, Andromeda sharing stories of the Black family that helped Harry understand his heritage beyond the political power and ancient grudges. She told him about relatives who'd been disowned for choosing love over purity, about family members who'd fought against darkness in their own ways, about the complex legacy he'd inherited, along with his title. "There are others," she said, as she prepared to leave. "Families who've had their own struggles with Dumbledore's executive decisions. Augusta Longbottom, for one. She's never forgotten how he handled her son's assignment to dangerous missions during the war. She may not speak publicly, but she understands the importance of accountability." That evening, as if summoned by Andromeda's words, an owl arrived bearing the Longbottom family crest. The letter inside was brief but significant. "Lord Black, while I cannot speak publicly on matters that might affect my grandson's education, please know that there are those who believe in the importance of holding even our most respected leaders accountable for their decisions. The law exists to protect all of us, not merely to be convenient for those in power. Respectfully, Augusta Longbottom." Harry carefully filed the letter with his other correspondence, understanding the careful political balance the woman was striking. Support without open endorsement, recognition without public commitment. The final letter of the day came just as Harry was preparing for bed, delivered by a phoenix whose golden feathers seemed to glow in the lamplight. The sight of Fawkes sent a complex mixture of emotions through Harry, fond memories of the bird's help in the Chamber of Secrets, mixed with new wariness about its master's intentions. "My dear Harry, I hope this letter finds you well. I must confess to being deeply saddened by recent developments, particularly by what appears to be a serious misunderstanding about the decisions made regarding your welfare after your parents' tragic death. I believe many of these concerns could be addressed through private conversation rather than public proceedings. Would you be willing to meet with me tomorrow evening? I have always been available to discuss any questions you might have, and I fear that formal legal proceedings may obscure rather than illuminate the truth you seek. I remain, as always, concerned for your well-being and hopeful that we can resolve these matters in a way that serves everyone's best interests. Most fondly, Albus Dumbledore. Harry read the letter 3 times, noting the careful language, the gentle manipulation disguised as grandfatherly concern. A month ago, he might have been swayed by the familiar tone, the implication that he was acting rashly. Now, with legal knowledge and political awareness flowing through his mind, he could see the attempt to circumvent the formal process for what it was. He pulled out a piece of parchment and began to write his response, his quill moving with steady confidence across the page. Professor Dumbledore, thank you for your letter. However, I believe that serious allegations of legal violations are best addressed through proper legal channels, rather than private meetings. The Wizengamot session will provide the appropriate forum for all relevant testimony to be heard and evaluated. I look forward to seeing you there on September 10th. Sincerely, Lord Black. As he sealed the letter, Harry felt the weight of the path he'd chosen settling around him like armor. In 8 days, he would stand before the most powerful figures in the wizarding world and demand answers that had been hidden for 13 years. The war for truth was accelerating, and Harry Potter, Lord Black, was ready for the battle to come. Harry had been expecting Dumbledore's visit for 3 days, ever since he'd sent his politely dismissive response to the headmaster's request for a private meeting. What he hadn't expected was for the most powerful wizard in Britain to arrive at the Leaky Cauldron, looking every inch the kindly grandfather, complete with half-moon spectacles twinkling in the lamplight and a small bag of lemon drops clutched in his weathered hand. "Harry, my dear boy," Dumbledore said, as Tom ushered him into the private parlour, his voice carrying all the warmth and gentle concern that had once made Harry feel safe and protected. "How wonderful to see you looking so well. I do hope you've been taking care of yourself during this difficult time." Harry remained seated as Dumbledore settled into the chair across from him, a calculated decision born from his recent education in political power dynamics. The old man's blue eyes, usually twinkling with benevolent wisdom, seemed to probe Harry's face with uncomfortable intensity. "Professor Dumbledore," Harry's voice was carefully neutral, "I wasn't expecting you to come in person." "Oh, but how could I not?" Dumbledore's smile was grandfatherly perfection as he offered the bag of sweets. "Lemon drop? I find they help clarify difficult conversations." "No, thank you." Harry noted how the refusal caused the slightest flicker of surprise in Dumbledore's expression. In the past, he'd always accepted whatever Dumbledore offered: food, advice, reassurance. This small act of independence seemed to register as something significant. "Harry, I fear there has been a terrible misunderstanding." Dumbledore leaned forward slightly, his tone taking on the patient quality of a teacher explaining a complex concept to a confused student. "The decisions made regarding your placement after your parents' death were not taken lightly. Every choice was made with your safety and well-being in mind." "My safety." Harry's voice remained level, but the Black family ring grew warm on his finger. "Is that what you'd call 13 years of emotional abuse, malnutrition, and isolation? The blood protection could have been maintained through other means," Harry interrupted, causing Dumbledore's eyebrows to rise in genuine surprise. "I've done my research, Professor. Blood wards can be anchored to any location where a blood relative resides. There are 7 documented cases of such protections being successfully transferred to more suitable guardians." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, and Harry could almost see the wheels turning behind those piercing blue eyes. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted subtly, less grandfatherly warmth, more intellectual respect. "You have indeed been studying. I must say, I'm impressed by your dedication to legal research." The pause before dedication carried just enough weight to suggest that Harry's efforts were perhaps misguided, if admirable. "However, my dear boy, there were other considerations. complexities that a formal legal proceeding cannot properly address. Such as the greater good, Harry. Sometimes individual sacrifices must be made to serve a larger purpose. Dumbledore's voice took on the resonant quality he used for his most important pronouncements. Your childhood, while regrettably difficult, prepared you for challenges that comfort could not. You emerged stronger, more compassionate, more capable of understanding suffering. You're saying my abuse was intentional? The words came out sharper than Harry intended, and for the first time since Dumbledore's arrival, genuine anger flickered in his voice. Not abuse, Harry. Hardship. Character-building experiences that nearly killed me. Harry stood abruptly, the ring pulsing with warmth as black family memories of political rhetoric flowed through his consciousness. You're trying to frame child neglect as some kind of noble pedagogy, Professor. That's not wisdom. It's rationalization. Dumbledore's mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the grandfatherly exterior. You speak with remarkable sophistication for someone your age, Harry. One might wonder who has been advising you in these matters. The implicit threat was clear. Dumbledore was probing for information about Sirius, about Harry's support network, about vulnerabilities he could exploit. Harry had expected this. I've had excellent teachers, Harry replied calmly. Legal texts, historical precedents, the kind of education most wizarding children receive, but that was deliberately withheld from me. Education is indeed important. Dumbledore's tone shifted again, becoming more pointed. Which brings me to a delicate matter. Your continued enrollment at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Harry felt his stomach clench, but kept his expression neutral. Are you threatening to expel me, Professor? Threatening? Oh, my dear boy. Nothing so dramatic. Dumbledore's smile returned, but it no longer reached his eyes. However, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that Hogwarts has certain standards regarding the conduct of its students. Public accusations against the school's administration could be seen as incompatible with the trust and respect we expect from our pupils. I see. Harry remained standing, using his height advantage to maintain psychological control of the conversation. And if I were to withdraw my completely legal and properly filed accusations against you, my place at Hogwarts would be secure. I would hate to see your education suffer due to youthful indiscretion. Harry smiled for the first time since Dumbledore's arrival, and something in that expression made the older wizard's eyes narrow slightly. Professor, you seem to be under the impression that Hogwarts is my only educational option. I beg your pardon? As Lord Black, I have access to private tutoring, international magical schools, and independent study programs that most wizarding children could only dream of. Harry's voice carried a confidence that surprised even him. Beauxbaton has already sent a preliminary inquiry about enrollment, as has Durmstrang. The Black family has historic ties to both institutions. This was a calculated bluff. Harry had no such inquiries, but the ring on his finger pulsed with approval, as if centuries of Black political instincts recognized a well-played gambit. Dumbledore's composure cracked further. Harry, you must understand. I understand perfectly, Professor. You're attempting to use my education as leverage to prevent me from exercising my legal rights. That's precisely the kind of abuse of authority that my accusations address. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Dumbledore's grandfather mask had fallen away entirely now, replaced by the cold assessment of a political strategist whose opening moves had failed. When he spoke again, his voice carried a harder edge. You are making a grave mistake, Harry. The consequences of these accusations extend far beyond personal grievances. The stability of our entire society will survive the application of its own laws, Harry interrupted. Unless you're suggesting that our legal system is too fragile to function when actually used? Before Dumbledore could respond, a soft knock interrupted the confrontation. Tom's voice came through the door. "Begging your pardon, Lord Black, but Professor McGonagall is here to see you." Harry felt his resolve waver for the first time. McGonagall, the teacher who had shown him the first kindness he'd ever received at Hogwarts, who had fought for him, protected him, believed in him. The thought of facing her across this divide made his chest tighten with an emotion that felt dangerously close to grief. "Send her in, Tom," Harry called, his voice slightly less steady than before. Minerva McGonagall entered the parlour looking older than Harry had ever seen her. Her usually perfect posture was slightly stooped, her sharp eyes clouded with something that might have been shame. She glanced between Harry and Dumbledore with the expression of someone witnessing a disaster she was powerless to prevent. "Professor McGonagall," Harry said, gesturing to a third chair. "Please sit down." She took the offered seat, but remained silent, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The tension in the room ratcheted higher. 3 points of a triangle, connected by years of shared history and mutual respect, now strained to the breaking point. "Minerva," Dumbledore said gently, "perhaps you could help Harry to understand the larger implications of his actions." McGonagall's sharp green eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. "Don't, Albus. Don't ask me to do your persuading for you. I'm simply suggesting you're asking me to convince a child to abandon his pursuit of justice because it's politically inconvenient." McGonagall's voice was crisp with controlled fury. "I won't do it." Harry stared at his favourite teacher in surprise. Whatever he'd expected from this confrontation, it wasn't McGonagall taking his side against Dumbledore. "Harry," she said, turning to face him directly, "what you're doing is difficult and necessary. And I'm sorry, so very sorry, that it's necessary at all." "Professor McGonagall—" "No, let me finish." Her voice was steady but pained. "I knew. We all knew how those relatives of yours treated you, and we did nothing. We told ourselves it was for your own good, that there were larger concerns at play. We were wrong." Dumbledore's expression had gone completely cold. "Minerva, you're speaking from emotion rather than wisdom." "Am I?" She turned to face him with the full force of her personality. "Tell me, Albus, when exactly did the greater good start requiring us to ignore the suffering of children? When did justice become subordinate to political convenience?" The silence that followed was deafening. Harry found himself in the surreal position of watching his 2 most respected teachers engage in a philosophical battle over his childhood, his rights, his very worth as a person. Finally, Dumbledore rose from his chair, his movements carrying the weight of his considerable age for the first time in Harry's memory. "I see that minds have been made up here. I hope, for all our sakes, that this course of action doesn't lead to consequences you're not prepared to face." He moved toward the door, pausing only to look back at Harry with an expression that was impossible to read. "The offer of a private resolution remains open, Harry. I suggest you consider it carefully before September 10th. After he left, the parlour felt oddly empty despite McGonagall's presence. She sat in silence for several minutes, staring at her hands with the expression of someone reassessing fundamental beliefs about the world. "Professor," Harry said quietly, "I never wanted to hurt you." "Oh, child." She looked up at him with eyes that glistened with unshed tears. "You're not hurting me. You're forcing me to face the truth about choices I've made, compromises I've accepted. That's not cruelty. That's courage." Harry felt his own emotions threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. "I don't feel courageous. I feel scared and alone and way too young to be doing any of this." "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Mr. Potter. It's doing what's right, despite the fear." McGonagall's voice carried the firm warmth that had always made him feel safe in her classroom. "And you are absolutely doing what's right." As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "The session is in 4 days?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then I'll see you there. And Harry, She turned back one final time. Your parents would be proud. After she left, Harry sank into his chair, emotionally drained by the confrontation. Dumbledore's visit had accomplished the opposite of its intended purpose. Instead of intimidating Harry into withdrawal, it had shown him exactly what he was fighting against: the casual arrogance of power, the assumption that good intentions justified any method, the willingness to sacrifice individual rights for abstract ideals. In 4 days, he would face Dumbledore again, this time in a forum where charm and manipulation would be constrained by legal procedure and public scrutiny. Harry Potter, Lord Black, was ready for that battle. Harry stood before the mirror in his room at the Leaky Cauldron, adjusting the formal robes that had been delivered the previous evening. The garments were magnificent, deep black wool with silver threading that traced the constellation patterns of the Black family crest across the chest and sleeves. The robes fit perfectly, as if they had been waiting 13 years for their rightful owner to claim them. The Black family ring felt heavier than usual on his finger, pulsing with what seemed like anticipation. In 2 hours, Harry would stand before the most powerful magical governing body in Britain and formally accuse Albus Dumbledore of crimes against a child. The magnitude of what he was attempting made his stomach churn with nervous energy, but beneath the fear lay something stronger, a cold certainty that justice was worth any personal cost. He descended to the Leaky Cauldron's main bar, to find it unusually crowded for a weekday morning. Witches and wizards who normally would have been at work instead clustered around tables, their voices carrying an electric buzz of anticipation. The emergency Wizengamot session had become the most anticipated political event in decades, and everyone wanted to be near the center of the storm. "Lord Black," Tom the innkeeper called, hurrying over with obvious nervousness. "Your carriage is waiting, sir. Ministry officials, very formal. Said they were here to escort you to the chambers." Harry nodded his thanks and made his way outside, where an ornate black carriage waited, pulled by 2 winged horses whose dark coats gleamed like obsidian. The ministry escort, 2 Aurors in formal dress robes, bowed respectfully as he approached. "Lord Black," the senior Auror said, "we're honored to provide your transport to the Wizengamot chambers. The proceedings are scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock sharp." The ride to the ministry felt both endless and instantaneous. Harry watched London pass outside the carriage windows, noting how the Muggle city gave way to the magical districts that most non-magical people never noticed. His hands remained steady on his knees, but his mind raced through the legal arguments he'd memorized, the precedents he would cite, the questions he would ask. The ministry atrium buzzed with unprecedented activity. Reporters from multiple wizarding publications had gathered near the lifts, their quick quotes quills poised and their cameras flashing. Harry caught sight of Rita Skeeter's distinctive blonde hair and acid-green robes near the center of the media scrum. "Lord Black! Lord Black!" the voices called out as he passed, but the Auror escort maintained a protective formation around him, preventing any impromptu interviews. How does it feel to challenge the most respected wizard of our age? What evidence do you have against Professor Dumbledore? Is it true you're seeking revenge for your godfather's imprisonment? Harry kept his expression neutral and his pace steady, though internally he noted how the questions already revealed the media's preferred narrative angles. The lift to the Wizengamot chambers seemed to take forever, stopping at multiple floors as ministry employees craned their necks for glimpses of the boy who was about to reshape their political landscape. The Wizengamot chambers were unlike anything Harry had imagined. The circular room stretched upward like an amphitheater, with tiered seating for nearly 200 members surrounding a central speaking area. Ancient tapestries, bearing the crests of the sacred 28 families, hung from the walls, and magical torches cast dancing shadows across stone that had witnessed centuries of magical jurisprudence. But what struck Harry most was the sheer number of people present. Every hereditary seat appeared to be occupied, an unprecedented turnout that spoke to the gravity of the day's proceedings. The public gallery, normally sparsely filled, was packed with observers whose whispered conversations created a low buzz of anticipation. Harry made his way to the Black family seat, a chair carved from what looked like midnight black marble and inlaid with silver stars. As he settled into it, he felt a strange sensation, as if the chair itself were welcoming him home, recognizing him as its rightful occupant. At precisely 10 o'clock, Chief Warlock Dumbledore entered through the official door, his usual colourful robes replaced by the formal purple and gold of his office. Their eyes met across the chamber, and Harry saw something he'd never seen before in Dumbledore's expression: uncertainty. "The emergency session of the Wizengamot will come to order," Dumbledore announced, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, despite its subdued tone. "We gather today in response to a formal request from Lord Black of the most ancient and noble House of Black." Harry stood, feeling the weight of 2 centuries of tradition settling on his shoulders. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the chamber, steady and formal, despite his racing heart. "Honourable members of the Wizengamot, I thank you for gathering to address matters of grave legal concern that have remained unresolved for too long." He paused, allowing the formal words to settle. "I call upon this body to examine violations of our most fundamental laws regarding the protection of magical children and the proper administration of justice." A murmur ran through the assembled members. Minister Fudge, seated in his official position, leaned forward with obvious discomfort. "Lord Black," he interrupted, "while we certainly respect your right to call this session, these are very serious accusations you appear to be making. Perhaps you could clarify exactly what." "Minister Fudge," Harry replied, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned from legal texts and Black family precedents. "I would ask that proper procedure be followed. As the requesting member, I am entitled to present my full case before questions or comments from the floor." Amelia Bones, seated with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement officials, nodded approvingly. "Lord Black is correct, Minister. Wizengamot rules clearly state that the requesting member has the right to present their case in full." Fudge subsided with obvious reluctance, and Harry continued, "Honourable members, I stand before you today to address 3 fundamental violations of magical law. First, the unlawful imprisonment of Sirius Black without trial, contrary to our most basic principles of justice. Second, the illegal placement of a magical minor, myself, with non-magical guardians without consent from my designated magical guardian. Third, the ongoing cover-up of these violations by officials who placed political convenience above legal obligation." The chamber had gone completely silent. Harry reached into his formal robes and withdrew a folder containing copies of documents from the Black family vault. "I present to this body certified copies of my parents' will, clearly naming Sirius Black as my magical guardian. I present records from the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes showing that Mr. Black was arrested and imprisoned without formal charges or trial. And I present correspondence proving that alternatives to my placement with abusive relatives were available and deliberately ignored." Harry distributed copies of the documents to the chamber clerks, who began passing them among the members. The rustle of parchment filled the air as the Wizengamot reviewed evidence that most of them were seeing for the first time. "Lord Black," came a voice from the Malfoy family section. "These are serious accusations indeed. But surely you understand that extraordinary circumstances sometimes require extraordinary measures. The Dark Lord's defeat created chaos that—" "Lord Malfoy," Harry interrupted smoothly, having anticipated this line of argument. "I would direct your attention to the Emergency Powers Act of 1979, which clearly states that suspension of normal legal procedures requires formal declaration by this body and expires automatically after 6 months. No such declaration was made regarding Mr. Black's case." An impressed murmur ran through the chamber. Several members exchanged glances that suggested they were re-evaluating their assumptions about the young lord's preparation and legal knowledge. "Furthermore," Harry continued, "I would note that similar wartime situations have been handled through proper legal channels in the past. The cases of Selwyn versus the Ministry in 1943 and the Bones family trials of 1971 both involved suspected Death Eater activities, and were resolved through formal proceedings that protected both public safety and individual rights. Amelia Bones's eyebrows rose at the mention of her own family's case, and she nodded with what might have been approval. Minister Fudge tried again to regain control. Lord Black, while your research is impressive, surely you can understand that sometimes those in authority must make difficult decisions for the greater good. Minister, Harry's voice cut across the chamber with surprising steel. Are you arguing that the greater good requires us to ignore our own laws? Because if so, I would suggest that our entire system of government is built on a foundation of sand. The silence that followed was deafening. Harry had just accused the Minister of Magic of advocating lawlessness in front of the entire Wizengamot. Chief Warlock Dumbledore finally spoke, his voice carrying its usual measured authority, despite the unprecedented circumstances. Lord Black, these matters are indeed serious. What exactly are you requesting from this body? Harry straightened, feeling the Black family ring pulse with warmth as centuries of political instinct guided his words. I request that this body hear testimony from the individuals responsible for the decisions in question. I further request that we examine whether these violations represent individual errors in judgment or systemic failures that require institutional reform. And the witnesses you wish to call? I begin with Mrs. Arabella Figg of Little Whinging, Surrey, who can testify to the conditions of my placement and the reporting structure that allowed my abuse to continue unaddressed. Another murmur ran through the chamber. Mrs. Figg was hardly a prominent figure, but her role as a witness suggested that Harry's case was built on detailed factual foundation rather than political grandstanding. Very well, Dumbledore said, his voice betraying nothing of his inner thoughts. Let Mrs. Figg be called to give testimony. As the chamber clerks went to fetch the first witness, Harry remained standing at his seat, feeling the weight of history settling around him. The boy who had lived in a cupboard was gone forever. In his place stood Lord Black, armed with law and evidence and the determination to ensure that justice would finally be served. The war for truth had begun in earnest, and Harry could feel the tide beginning to turn. Mrs. Arabella Figg entered the Wizengamot chambers with the nervous gait of someone who had never expected to find herself at the center of such momentous proceedings. She was a thin, elderly woman with wild grey hair and an expression that suggested she would rather be anywhere else in the wizarding world. Harry watched her approach the witness chair with a mixture of curiosity and growing dread. Whatever she was about to reveal, he sensed it would change his understanding of his childhood forever. Mrs. Figg, Harry began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. Would you please state your relationship to me and your residence? I'm Arabella Figg, she said, her voice trembling slightly as she glanced around the intimidating chamber. I live on Wisteria Walk in Little Whinging, Surrey. I've been watching you since you were a baby, Harry. Watching me in what capacity? Mrs. Figg's eyes darted toward Dumbledore, who sat motionless in the Chief Warlock's chair, his expression revealing nothing. She wrung her hands in her lap before answering. I'm a squib, Harry, born into a magical family, but with no magic of my own. Professor Dumbledore arranged for me to live near Privet Drive to keep an eye on you, to report back if anything unusual happened. A shocked murmur ran through the chamber. Harry felt as though the floor had shifted beneath him. You were spying on me. For 13 years. Not spying exactly, Mrs. Figg said miserably. Watching over you, making sure you were safe. And what exactly did you report to Professor Dumbledore about my treatment at the hands of my relatives? The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Figg's face crumpled as if she were about to cry. I reported everything, Harry. The way they made you do all the housework while that cousin of yours did nothing. The way they locked you in your room for days at a time. The bars on your windows. The way they talked about magic like it was something shameful and disgusting. Her voice broke. I told Professor Dumbledore that they were cruel to you, that they didn't love you, that you were miserable. And what was his response to these reports? He said, Mrs. Figg paused, glancing again at Dumbledore with something that might have been betrayal in her eyes. He said it was necessary, that you needed to understand hardship to build character, that being loved too much would make you arrogant like your father had been. Harry felt the blood drain from his face. The chamber erupted in shocked whispers, but he forced himself to continue with the questioning. Mrs. Figg, in your professional opinion, as someone tasked with monitoring my welfare, were the conditions I endured suitable for any child? No, she whispered, tears now streaming down her cheeks. No child should have to live like that. I wanted to intervene so many times, but Professor Dumbledore said it was for the greater good. He said you needed to be humble and grateful when you finally learned about the wizarding world. Harry sat down heavily, his legs suddenly unsteady. The revelation that his suffering had been not just observed but deliberately maintained crashed over him like a physical blow. He gestured to the chamber clerks. Call Rubeus Hagrid. Hagrid entered the chamber looking like a giant forced into a child's playhouse, his massive frame barely fitting through the doorway. His beetle-black eyes were red-rimmed, and his hands shook as he settled into the witness chair, which expanded magically to accommodate his bulk. Hagrid, Harry said gently, his voice softer now, because this man, whatever his role in the conspiracy, had been genuinely kind to him. You were the one who delivered me to Privet Drive as an infant, weren't you? Aye, Hagrid rumbled, his voice thick with emotion. November 1st, 1981. Flew you there on me motorbike after what happened to your parents. Were you given any specific instructions regarding what I should or shouldn't be told about my parents or the wizarding world? Hagrid's massive hands clenched in his lap. Professor Dumbledore said. He said you were to grow up away from all that. That you shouldn't know about your fame, about what you did that night. Said it would be better if you came to Hogwarts without expectations, without thinking you were something special. And when you retrieved me for my first year at Hogwarts, you found me living in a cupboard under the stairs, didn't you? I did. Hagrid's voice was barely above a whisper. When I saw that cupboard, saw how thin you were, how small, I wanted to say something right then. But Professor Dumbledore had made it clear that I wasn't to interfere. Did you report my living conditions to anyone? I told Professor Dumbledore everything when I got back. About the cupboard, about how your relatives had never told you anything about magic, about how scared and confused you were. Hagrid looked up at Harry with eyes full of pain. He just nodded and said it was as expected. Harry closed his eyes briefly, fighting against the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. When he opened them again, his voice was steady but cold. Call Professor Minerva McGonagall. McGonagall entered with the bearing of someone walking to her own execution. Her usually perfect posture was slightly stooped, and her face was pale beneath her stern exterior. She took the witness chair with the dignity of someone who knew she deserved whatever judgment was about to fall upon her. Professor McGonagall, Harry began, his voice gentler than it had been with the previous witnesses. You were present when I was delivered to Privet Drive, weren't you? I was. Her voice was crisp, professional, but Harry could hear the underlying tremor. And you had observed my relatives prior to my placement there? McGonagall's jaw tightened. I had spent the entire day watching the Dursley family. I observed their behavior, their treatment of their own son, their attitudes toward anything they considered abnormal or different. And what was your assessment? I told Professor Dumbledore that they were the worst sort of muggles, cruel, narrow-minded, and completely unsuitable as guardians for any child, let alone one as remarkable as you. McGonagall's voice grew stronger as she continued, as if confessing was bringing her some relief. I argued against the placement. I told him you would be better served by any number of magical families who would have been honored to raise you. Harry leaned forward, his voice taking on an edge that made several Wizengamot members shift uncomfortably. And yet I was left there anyway. Yes. For 13 years. Yes. During which time you continued to receive reports about my treatment from Mrs. Figg and others? McGonagall's composure finally cracked. Yes. Every year, I received detailed reports about your living conditions, about the emotional abuse, the isolation, the way they tried to suppress your magical nature. Every year, I brought my concerns to Professor Dumbledore. And his response? He said it was necessary. McGonagall's voice broke completely now, tears streaming down her face. He said you needed to understand suffering, to develop empathy, that you needed to be kept humble to prevent you from becoming a dark wizard like others who had been praised too much in their youth. The chamber was utterly silent, except for McGonagall's quiet sobs. Harry stood slowly, his voice carrying a new authority that made several members of the Wizengamot unconsciously lean forward. Professor McGonagall, as Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts and a senior member of the wizarding community, did you not have a duty of care to protect a child under your educational jurisdiction? I did. The words came out as a whisper. And did you fulfill that duty? No. McGonagall looked directly at Harry, her eyes red with tears and shame. I failed you, Harry. I failed you completely. I chose loyalty to Professor Dumbledore over my duty to protect you, and I will carry that shame for the rest of my life. The silence that followed was broken by murmurs of shock and dismay from the assembled Wizengamot members. Several of them were staring at Dumbledore with expressions of growing horror and disbelief. Lord Malfoy chose that moment to rise from his seat, his pale eyes glittering with political opportunity. Surely this body must recognize the pattern of systematic abuse and cover-up that these testimonies reveal. The question becomes, if our most respected leaders are willing to sacrifice one child for their interpretation of the greater good, how many others have suffered in silence? Harry immediately recognized the trap Malfoy was setting, using legitimate outrage to advance his own agenda against Dumbledore. Before anyone could respond, Harry stood and addressed the chamber directly. Lord Malfoy raises valid concerns about systematic issues, but I would caution this body against allowing righteous anger to be exploited for political gain. Harry's voice carried a diplomatic skill that surprised even himself. The question before us is not whether Professor Dumbledore's enemies can benefit from his mistakes, but whether our legal system has the integrity to address violations regardless of who commits them. Malfoy's smile faltered slightly as Harry continued. If Lord Malfoy is genuinely concerned about the welfare of magical children, I'm sure he'll support comprehensive reforms to our guardianship laws rather than simply using this situation to settle old political scores. Several members of the Wizengamot nodded approvingly at Harry's response, while Malfoy subsided with obvious frustration. Harry had deflected the political maneuvering while keeping the focus on legal rather than personal issues. Amelia Bones stood from her seat among the law enforcement officials. Lord Black, the testimony we've heard today is deeply disturbing. Before we proceed further, I believe this body needs to understand the full scope of knowledge and complicity. Will you be calling Professor Dumbledore to testify? Harry looked across the chamber at the man who had shaped his entire life from the shadows, who had orchestrated his suffering while maintaining the facade of a kindly grandfather. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 13 years of pain and the authority of 6 centuries of black family justice. Yes, Madam Bones, Professor Dumbledore will be my final witness. The chamber erupted in whispers and gasps. Harry remained standing, his formal robes and the black family ring marking him not as the abused child he had been, but as the young lord he had become, someone with the power to demand answers and the determination to see justice done. The war for truth was approaching its climax, and Harry Potter, Lord Black, was ready to face the architect of his suffering. The silence in the Wizengamot chamber was absolute as Albus Dumbledore rose from the Chief Warlock's chair and made his way to the witness stand. For the first time in Harry's memory, the man who had always seemed larger than life appeared diminished, his usual commanding presence reduced to that of an elderly wizard facing judgment for his choices. Dumbledore settled into the witness chair with the same dignity he brought to everything else, his blue eyes meeting Harry's across the chamber. There was something unreadable in that gaze, disappointment, perhaps, or a sadness that seemed to encompass more than just this moment. "Professor Dumbledore," Harry began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, "you have served as Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot for the past 12 years. Is that correct?" "It is. And in that capacity, you are familiar with the legal requirements for detention and trial of suspected criminals." "I am." Harry felt the Black family ring pulse with warmth as he prepared to ask the question that would destroy any remaining doubt about Sirius's treatment. "Professor Dumbledore, was Sirius Black ever formally charged with a crime before his imprisonment in Azkaban?" The pause that followed stretched for what felt like an eternity. When Dumbledore finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "No, he was not formally charged." "Was he given a trial?" "No." "Was any evidence presented against him in a formal proceeding?" "No." The admission sent a visible shock through the assembled members. Several began whispering urgently to their neighbors, while others stared at Dumbledore with expressions of growing disbelief. Harry pressed forward, his confidence growing with each devastating admission. "Professor Dumbledore, as Chief Warlock, you had the authority to demand a trial for Mr. Black, didn't you?" "I did." "And you chose not to exercise that authority?" "I believed the evidence of his guilt was overwhelming." "What evidence?" Harry's voice carried a steel that made several Wizengamot members lean forward in their seats. "You just admitted that no evidence was presented in any formal proceeding. What evidence convinced you to allow the imprisonment of an innocent man without trial?" Dumbledore's composure finally showed the first signs of cracking. The circumstances strongly suggested— "The circumstances," Harry interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Professor Dumbledore, are you telling this body that you allowed a man to be imprisoned for 12 years based on circumstances rather than evidence?" "Harry, you must understand." "Lord Black," Harry corrected sharply. "You will address me by my proper title, Professor Dumbledore. This is a formal legal proceeding, not a private conversation." The correction landed like a physical blow. Dumbledore straightened slightly, and when he continued, his voice carried a harder edge. "Lord Black, the decisions made in those dark days were not taken lightly. The war against Voldemort required difficult choices. Did the war require you to ignore wizarding law?" "Sometimes, yes." The admission sent another shock through the chamber. Harry could see several members exchanging glances that spoke of fundamental shifts in their perceptions of the man they had trusted for decades. "Professor Dumbledore, please explain to this body how my placement with abusive relatives served the war effort against Voldemort." Dumbledore leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the resonant quality he used for his most important pronouncements. "Your placement with your mother's blood relatives was necessary to maintain the protection her sacrifice provided. The blood wards could have been maintained through alternative arrangements," Harry interrupted, producing a document from his folder. "I present to this body a certified copy of research conducted by the Black family in 1847, documenting successful transfer of blood protection spells to suitable magical guardians while maintaining their effectiveness." Dumbledore's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. "Ancient research cannot account for the specific circumstances. Then perhaps you could explain why those specific circumstances required me to be placed with people who locked me in a cupboard for the first 11 years of my life. Your experiences shaped your character, Lord Black. They taught you humility, compassion for the suffering of others. They taught me that I was worthless." Harry's voice cut across Dumbledore's words like a blade. "They taught me that magic was evil, and that I was a freak for possessing it. They taught me to expect cruelty from the people who were supposed to protect me. Harry stood, his formal robes and the black family ring catching the magical torchlight. Professor Dumbledore, you are arguing that child abuse was beneficial to my development. Do you stand by that position? The silence that followed was deafening. Dumbledore's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady when he answered. I believed that some hardship was necessary to prevent you from developing the arrogance and sense of entitlement that can lead talented young wizards down dark paths. You believed abuse would prevent me from becoming a dark wizard? I believed that experiencing suffering would help you understand its cost, yes. Harry felt a cold fury building in his chest, but his voice remained controlled. Professor Dumbledore, how many other children have you subjected to deliberate abuse to prevent them from becoming dark wizards? Your situation was unique. How many? Harry's voice carried absolute authority now, and several members of the Wizengamot seemed to unconsciously lean forward, waiting for the answer. None, Dumbledore admitted quietly. So you experimented on me. You decided that one specific orphaned child should suffer deliberate abuse as a test of your theory about character development. Lord Black, you are oversimplifying. Professor Dumbledore, Harry continued relentlessly, you have testified that you knew about my abuse through Mrs. Figg's reports and Professor McGonagall's concerns. You have admitted that alternative arrangements were possible. You have acknowledged that no other children were subjected to similar treatment. Given these facts, how do you justify your decision to leave me with the Dursleys? Dumbledore was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes studying Harry with an intensity that would have intimidated him just months ago. Now, with the black family ring warm on his finger and centuries of political wisdom flowing through his consciousness, Harry met that gaze with steady confidence. I believed, Dumbledore said finally, that your survival was more important than your happiness. My survival from what, specifically? From the corrupting influence of fame, power, and the expectations of others. Harry pulled another document from his folder. I present to this body a list of magical families who requested guardianship of the Potter orphan following my parents' death. 17 separate families, Professor Dumbledore, all of them properly vetted by the Ministry, all of them offering loving homes where I could have grown up knowing my heritage while remaining humble and grounded. The rustling of parchment filled the chamber as copies of the list were distributed among the members. Harry could see shock and growing anger on many faces as they read the names of respected families who would have gladly raised him. Professor Dumbledore, are you familiar with this list? I am. And you rejected all of these offers in favor of placing me with abusive relatives? I believed the blood protection was paramount. Even though you know that blood wards could have been transferred to any of these families while maintaining their effectiveness? Dumbledore's mask was slipping now, his grandfatherly facade giving way to something harder and more calculating. Lord Black, you cannot understand the broader implications. Then explain them, Harry challenged. Explain to this body how the broader implications justified 13 years of psychological torture for a child whose only crime was surviving a murder attempt. Harry, Lord Black, you emerged from that experience stronger, more compassionate, more capable of making the right choices. I emerged traumatized, Professor Dumbledore. I emerged believing I deserved to be locked in a cupboard, that I was a burden to anyone who might care for me, that my very existence was a cause for shame. Harry's voice was gaining intensity now, though it remained controlled. If that was your definition of strength, then your understanding of human psychology is fundamentally flawed. The chamber erupted in whispers and shocked exclamations. Several members of the Wizengamot were staring at Dumbledore with expressions of horror and disbelief. Lord Abbot shook his head repeatedly, while Lady Bones had gone pale with what looked like suppressed fury. Amelia Bones rose from her seat among the law enforcement officials. Professor Dumbledore, Are you testifying under oath that you deliberately maintained a child in an abusive environment as an experiment in character development? I am testifying that I made difficult decisions based on my assessment of what would best serve the greater good. The greater good, Harry repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet. Professor Dumbledore, who decided that your interpretation of the greater good was more important than wizarding law. Who gave you the authority to ignore the will of my parents in favor of your personal theories about child-rearing? The circumstances required? Who appointed you to decide that one orphaned child should suffer deliberate abuse for the theoretical benefit of wizarding society? Dumbledore was silent now, his blue eyes no longer twinkling, his face showing every one of his 112 years. Harry stood silent for a moment, letting the weight of Dumbledore's non-answer settle over the chamber. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of 6 centuries of black family legal tradition. Members of the Wizengamot, you have heard testimony from multiple witnesses establishing a pattern of deliberate abuse, systematic cover-up, and flagrant violations of our most fundamental laws. Professor Dumbledore has admitted under oath that he possessed the knowledge and authority to prevent these violations, but chose not to act. He has further admitted that these choices were based on his personal theories rather than legal requirements or established precedent. Harry paused, his eyes sweeping across the assembled members. I submit to this body that what we have witnessed is not merely poor judgment, but a fundamental failure of the principles that govern our society. If our most respected leaders can ignore our laws whenever they deem it convenient, then we have no laws at all, only the arbitrary will of those who claim to know better than our legal system. The silence that followed was profound. Harry could see the impact of his words in the faces around him: shock, anger, and a growing recognition that something fundamental had broken in their understanding of justice and authority. Amelia Bones stood again, her voice carrying the weight of her office. I believe this body needs time to consider the evidence presented today before proceeding further. I call for a recess to allow members to review the testimony and documentation. As the chamber began to empty, Dumbledore remained seated in the witness chair, looking older and more defeated than Harry had ever seen him. Their eyes met across the emptying room, and Harry saw something in Dumbledore's gaze that might have been respect or regret, or simply the acknowledgement that the boy he had shaped through suffering had grown into someone capable of demanding justice from his tormentors. The war for truth had reached its climax, and Lord Black had emerged victorious. The Wizengamot chamber felt different when the session reconvened 2 hours later. The air crackled with tension that hadn't been present at the morning's opening, and Harry could see the effects of his revelations in the faces of the assembled members. Some looked shaken, their faith in established authority clearly rattled. Others appeared angry, whether at Dumbledore's actions or at Harry for exposing them. A few seemed calculating, already weighing the political implications of the day's testimony. Harry remained standing at his seat as the members filed back in, the black family ring warm against his finger. He had used the recess to review his notes and prepare for what he knew would be the most crucial part of the entire proceeding, the moment when he would ask this body to take concrete action rather than simply absorb shocking revelations. Chief Warlock Dumbledore entered last, his purple and gold robes somehow less magnificent than they had appeared that morning. He took his seat with the same dignity he had always displayed, but Harry could see the change in how other members regarded him. The automatic deference was gone, replaced by wary assessment and, in some cases, barely concealed hostility. "The emergency session will resume," Dumbledore announced, his voice carrying its usual authority despite the circumstances. "Lord Black, do you have further business to present to this body?" Harry rose, feeling the weight of history settling on his shoulders. What he was about to propose had not been attempted in over a century, but the precedents were clear, and the evidence was overwhelming. "Honorable members of the Wizengamot," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. "You have heard testimony establishing systematic violations of our most fundamental laws. You have heard evidence of abuse covered up, justice denied, and legal procedures ignored in favor of one man's personal judgment. The question before us now is whether this body will take action to prevent such violations from occurring again." Harry paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing. "I formally move for a vote of no confidence regarding Professor Albus Dumbledore's fitness to hold positions of authority over the welfare of children and the administration of justice." The chamber erupted in shocked whispers and gasps. Several members leaned forward in their seats, while others exchanged urgent glances with their neighbors. Harry had expected this reaction. What he was proposing was unprecedented in its scope and implications. Minister Fudge shot to his feet, his face flushed with obvious panic. "Lord Black, surely you cannot be serious. Professor Dumbledore is one of our most respected—" "Minister Fudge," Harry interrupted, his voice carrying the authority he had learned from legal texts and Black family tradition. "This body operates under formal procedures. I have made a motion, and it requires a second before discussion can proceed." The silence that followed was deafening. Harry could feel the political calculations occurring throughout the chamber as members weighed their options. Supporting Harry's motion would align them against Dumbledore, but in favor of legal accountability. Opposing it would defend Dumbledore, but potentially condone the violations he had admitted to under oath. Augusta Longbottom rose from her seat with the stately dignity that had made her a respected figure in wizarding society for decades. "I second Lord Black's motion." Her voice carried across the chamber with crystalline clarity, and Harry felt a surge of gratitude for the formidable woman's support. The political implications of her backing were significant. Augusta Longbottom was known for her integrity and her fierce protection of children, making her endorsement both powerful and principled. "The motion has been seconded," Dumbledore announced, his voice betraying nothing of his inner thoughts. "Discussion may proceed." Lord Greengrass stood immediately. "This motion is extreme and unnecessary. Professor Dumbledore has served our community with distinction for decades. One questionable decision, made under extraordinary wartime circumstances, does not justify—" "One questionable decision," Harry's voice cut across the chamber with controlled fury. "Lord Greengrass, Professor Dumbledore admitted under oath to 13 years of deliberately maintained child abuse. He acknowledged imprisoning an innocent man without trial. These are not questionable decisions. They are systematic violations of our legal foundation." Lady Bones rose next, her voice crisp with professional authority. "The evidence presented today raises fundamental questions about oversight and accountability. Regardless of Professor Dumbledore's past service, we cannot ignore systematic legal violations simply because they were committed by a respected figure." "And what of his role as Chief Warlock?" asked Lord Abbot, his voice heavy with concern. "If we pass this motion, are we suggesting that our entire legal system has been compromised?" "We are acknowledging," Harry replied before anyone else could respond, "that no one, regardless of reputation or past service, is above the law. The integrity of our legal system depends on our willingness to apply it consistently, especially to those in positions of power." Lucius Malfoy stood with the fluid grace that marked all his political maneuvering. "Lord Black raises valid concerns about accountability. How many other decisions has Professor Dumbledore made without proper consultation or legal foundation? How many other lives have been affected by his executive approach to difficult situations?" Harry recognized immediately what Malfoy was doing, using legitimate concerns to advance his own anti-Dumbledore agenda. But unlike their previous encounter, Harry had no need to deflect Malfoy's support. The man's motivations might be political, but his words served justice in this instance. "The question," continued Malfoy, is whether this body has the courage to hold our leaders accountable when they exceed their authority. Professor Dumbledore's testimony revealed a pattern of behavior that suggests he views himself as above the constraints that govern the rest of us. Augusta Longbottom rose again, her voice carrying the moral authority that had made her one of the most respected voices in the Wizengamot. I have sat in this chamber for 37 years. In that time, I have seen many difficult decisions made under extraordinary circumstances. But never before have I heard a sitting member admit under oath to deliberately maintaining conditions harmful to a child because he believed it served his interpretation of the greater good. She turned to face Dumbledore directly, her expression stern but not unkind. Albus, your service to our community has been remarkable. Your sacrifice and dedication are beyond question. But leadership requires accountability, and accountability requires consequences when fundamental lines are crossed. The debate continued for another hour, with members rising to speak for and against the motion. Harry listened carefully to each argument, occasionally responding when questions were directed to him, but mostly allowing the political process to unfold. He could sense the mood of the chamber, shifting gradually in favor of some form of action, though the exact nature of that action remained unclear. Finally, Amelia Bones stood and addressed the chamber. If I may suggest a compromise that serves both accountability and continuity, rather than a complete vote of no confidence, perhaps this body should consider formal oversight provisions for Professor Dumbledore's future decisions regarding child welfare and legal proceedings. What form would such oversight take? Asked Lord Greengrass. A committee of 3 Wizengamot members, appointed by this body, to review any decisions involving the placement or treatment of magical children. Additionally, a requirement that any future detention orders be presented to this body within 72 hours for formal review. Harry considered the proposal carefully. It wasn't as complete as his original motion, but it would establish crucial precedents and prevent future abuses. More importantly, it was likely to pass with broader support than a full vote of no confidence. I would accept such oversight provisions as an amendment to my motion, Harry announced, provided they include retroactive review of any ongoing cases and public reporting of the committee's findings. Agreed, said Amelia Bones. When the vote was finally called, the result was closer than Harry had hoped, but decisive enough to matter. 47 votes in favor, 32 opposed, with 18 abstentions. The motion carried. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. For the first time in the recorded history of the Wizengamot, sitting members had formally censured their chief warlock and imposed oversight on his authority. Dumbledore rose slowly, his face showing every one of his 112 years. I accept the will of this body, he said, his voice carrying its usual dignity despite the circumstances. The Oversight Committee has my full cooperation. Minister Fudge stood with obvious reluctance. Lord Black, on behalf of the Ministry of Magic, I must formally apologize for the failures of our system that led to your unfortunate experiences. The Ministry pledges to review our guardian placement procedures to ensure such violations cannot occur again. Harry inclined his head, accepting the apology with the grace his legal education had taught him. Minister Fudge, I appreciate the Ministry's acknowledgement. I trust that the reforms discussed today will prevent other children from experiencing similar injustices. As the session officially concluded and members began to file out of the chamber, Harry remained standing at the Black family seat. He had achieved more than he had dared hope when this journey began. Dumbledore's authority was formally constrained, oversight mechanisms were in place, and the Ministry had officially acknowledged the failures that had shaped his childhood. Dumbledore approached as the chamber emptied, moving with the careful gait of an old man who had endured a difficult day. "Harry," he said quietly, "you have accomplished something remarkable today." "Lord Black," Harry corrected gently but firmly. "And yes, Professor, I believe we have. I hope you understand that everything I did was motivated by genuine concern for your welfare and the safety of our community." Harry studied the man who had shaped his entire life from the shadows, feeling a complex mixture of anger, disappointment, and something that might have been pity. "Professor Dumbledore, I understand that you believed your actions were necessary, but good intentions do not excuse legal violations or justify child abuse. Today, this body affirmed that principle." Dumbledore nodded slowly. "Indeed. I hope the reforms implemented today serve our community well." As the old man walked away, Harry felt the weight of his victory settling on his shoulders. He had set out to seek justice for himself and Sirius, but what he had accomplished was far broader. He had established precedents that would protect future children and constrained the authority of those who might be tempted to place their personal judgment above the law. The boy who had lived in a cupboard was gone forever. In his place stood Lord Black, a young man who had learned that justice was not something granted by the powerful, but something demanded by those with the courage to fight for it. The war for truth was won. Harry woke the morning after the Wizengamot session to find his window at the Leaky Cauldron nearly black with owls. They perched on the sill, clustered on the roof across the street, and circled overhead in growing numbers as more arrived by the hour. Each bird carried newspapers, letters, or packages from a wizarding world that had been shaken to its foundations by the previous day's revelations. Tom knocked on his door before Harry had even finished getting dressed, his weathered face creased with amazement and concern. "Lord Black, sir, I've never seen anything like it. The Prophet Delivery Owl could barely carry all the papers they sent. And the letters—" He gestured helplessly toward the common room. "We've had to use the entire downstairs just to pile them up." Harry made his way downstairs to find the Leaky Cauldron's main room, transformed into something resembling a postal depot. Hundreds of letters covered every available surface, sorted roughly by the inn's staff into piles marked supportive, angry, threatening, and unclear intent. But it was the newspapers that caught Harry's attention first. The Daily Prophet's headline screamed across the front page in letters that seemed to pulse with their own indignation. "Boy who lived destroys Dumbledore's reputation in unprecedented Wizengamot attack." Rita Skeeter's byline promised exclusive details of shocking testimony that shattered our faith in the wizarding world's greatest hero. The Quibbler, surprisingly, had managed to produce a special edition with the more measured headline, "Young Lord Seeks Justice, Exposes Systematic Failures." Even Witch Weekly had weighed in with "The Brave Boy Who Demanded Better, Lord Black's Fight for All Our Children." Harry picked up the Prophet with trembling hands and began to read. In the most shocking Wizengamot session in living memory, 13-year-old Lord Harry Black yesterday presented evidence that our most beloved leader, Albus Dumbledore, deliberately maintained a magical child in abusive conditions for over a decade while covering up the wrongful imprisonment of an innocent man. The testimony, delivered with startling legal sophistication by the heir to the most ancient and noble house of Black, revealed a pattern of systematic law-breaking that has sent shockwaves through every level of wizarding society. The article continued for 3 full pages, detailing every damaging revelation from the previous day's session. Harry was surprised to find that Skeeter's reporting, while sensationalized, was largely accurate. She had clearly done her research and had access to detailed transcripts of the proceedings. A soft tapping at the window interrupted his reading. Fawkes perched outside, but this time the phoenix carried no letter from Dumbledore. Instead, a magnificent black owl with intelligent dark eyes waited beside the legendary bird. Harry opened the window, and the owl extended its leg to reveal a letter bearing the Black family crest. My dear godson, words cannot express how proud I am of what you accomplished yesterday. I watched the proceedings from a concealed location, using family magic to observe without being detected. To see you stand before the most powerful figures in our world and demand justice with such courage and skill, James and Lily would have burst with pride. You have done more than seek vindication for yourself and for me. You have reminded our world that laws exist to protect everyone, not just those with power. You have shown that even 13-year-old boys deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. I am safe now. The evidence you presented has effectively cleared my name, and the ministry will be forced to issue formal pardons within days. But more importantly, you are safe. You will never again be at the mercy of people who see you as a burden rather than a blessing. I would very much like to meet you properly before you return to school. There is a safe house in Grimmauld Place where we can speak freely. Simply touch your ring and say, "Padfoot calls me home," and the family magic will transport you there. I love you, Harry. I have loved you since the day you were born, and I will spend the rest of my life making up for the years I was unable to protect you. Your godfather, Sirius Harry, read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated. His godfather was safe, proud, and wanted to meet him. After 13 years of believing himself unwanted, Harry was about to have a conversation with someone who had loved him from birth. Another knock at the door interrupted his emotional moment. Tom entered with an official-looking witch in dark blue robes, bearing the insignia of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. "Lord Black," she said with a respectful bow. "I'm Aura Shacklebolt, here on behalf of Madam Bones. She requests the honor of your presence for a private meeting this afternoon, if you're available." Harry nodded, his mind still reeling from Sirius's letter. "Of course. What time?" 2 o'clock, sir." "And Lord Black?" Shacklebolt's expression grew more serious. "You should know that your actions yesterday have created significant political upheaval. There are those who see you as a hero for holding power accountable, and others who view you as a threat to stability. Madam Bones wanted me to advise you to be cautious about public appearances for the next few days." After Shacklebolt left, Harry spent the morning reading through the mountain of correspondence. The letters revealed a wizarding world divided and shaken by his revelations. Some writers expressed gratitude that someone had finally challenged Dumbledore's unchecked authority. Others accused Harry of being ungrateful, manipulated, or seeking attention. A few contained actual threats, which Tom immediately turned over to Ministry security. But it was the letters from parents that affected Harry most deeply. "Lord Black, your courage has inspired me to ask difficult questions about my own child's treatment at school. Thank you for showing us that even our most respected leaders must be held accountable. My son was placed with relatives after his parents died, and I never questioned whether it was the right decision. Your testimony has made me realize I should have asked more questions. You have reminded us that children deserve protection, not suffering disguised as character building." At 2 o'clock, Harry arrived at Amelia Bones's office to find her reviewing a stack of documents that seemed to have grown since his last visit. "Lord Black," she said, rising to greet him. "Please, sit. I wanted to speak with you about the aftermath of yesterday's session. The political upheaval Aura Shacklebolt mentioned, among other things." Bones settled behind her desk with the air of someone dealing with a crisis. "Your testimony has prompted dozens of families to file complaints about guardianship decisions made over the past 2 decades. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures is being questioned about their treatment of half-bloods and magical beings. Even the Hogwarts Board of Governors is demanding reviews of disciplinary policies. Harry felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. I never intended to cause chaos. You didn't cause chaos, Lord Black. You exposed problems that were already there. The chaos comes from people finally recognizing that our system has been failing its most vulnerable members for years. Bones leaned forward, her expression growing more serious. I have a proposition for you. Your legal skills, your political instincts, your ability to see injustice clearly. These are exactly the qualities we need in magical law enforcement. When you come of age, I would like to offer you a position in my department. Harry blinked in surprise. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you the chance to continue the work you started yesterday, to help us build a legal system that actually protects people rather than just serving the convenience of those in power. I'm honored, Madame Bones. But I'm only 13. You're 13 years old, and you just accomplished something that experienced politicians have been afraid to attempt for decades. Age is just a number, Lord Black. Character and ability matter more. That evening, Harry touched his ring and spoke the words Sirius had provided. The world dissolved around him in a swirl of silver light, and when it reformed, he found himself standing in the elegant entrance hall of Grimmauld Place. Sirius was waiting for him. The man who stood before Harry bore little resemblance to the gaunt prisoner whose photograph had terrorized the wizarding world. Clean, well-fed, and properly dressed, Sirius Black looked like what he was, a member of one of Wizarding Britain's oldest noble houses. But it was his eyes that captured Harry's attention. They were bright with intelligence, warmth, and an emotional depth that spoke of years of pain transformed into love. "Harry," Sirius said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sirius," Harry replied, and then found himself swept into the first truly loving embrace he could remember. They talked for hours, about James and Lily, about Harry's childhood, about Sirius's years in Azkaban, about the future they could finally plan together. Sirius shared stories of Harry's parents that no one else could tell, while Harry described his growing understanding of his magical heritage and political responsibilities. "You know," Sirius said as the evening grew late, "what you did yesterday will change more than just our family's fortunes. You've shown an entire generation of young witches and wizards that they don't have to accept injustice simply because it comes from respected authorities." Meanwhile, across magical Britain, the reverberations of Harry's victory continued to spread. At Hogwarts, Professor McGonagall sat in her office, composing a letter of resignation from her position as head of Gryffindor House, her hands steady despite the tears on her cheeks. She had failed in her duty to protect a child, and honor demanded consequences. In his tower office, Dumbledore reviewed correspondence from the International Confederation of Wizards, the Hogwarts Board of Governors, and a dozen other organizations questioning his various leadership roles. The Oversight Committee, established by the Wizengamot, was only the beginning. His authority was being challenged on multiple fronts. At the Ministry, Fudge held emergency meetings with department heads as they struggled to respond to hundreds of inquiries about past decisions and current policies. The comfortable assumptions that had governed wizarding society for decades were crumbling under the scrutiny that Harry's courage had inspired. As Harry prepared to return to the leaky cauldron, Sirius walked him to the entrance hall. "Are you ready for Hogwarts?" Sirius asked. "It's going to be different now. You're not just Harry Potter anymore. You're Lord Black, the boy who held Dumbledore accountable. Some people will see you as a hero. Others will see you as a threat." Harry considered the question carefully. "I'm ready," he said finally. "For the first time in my life, I know who I am and what I'm capable of. Whatever comes next, I can handle it." As the family magic transported him back to his room at the inn, Harry reflected on how completely his world had changed in just a few weeks. The frightened boy locked in a cupboard was gone forever. In his place stood Lord Black, a young man who had learned that justice was not a gift granted by the powerful, but a right that sometimes had to be fought for with every tool at one's disposal. The wizarding world would never be quite the same, and neither would Harry Potter. The Hogwarts Express had never felt quite like this before. As Harry walked through the corridors searching for an empty compartment, conversations died in his wake, replaced by whispered exchanges and wide-eyed stares. Some students looked at him with something approaching awe, while others seemed nervous, as if unsure how to behave around someone who had publicly challenged the most powerful wizard of their age. Harry was dressed in his usual Hogwarts robes, but the black family ring on his finger caught the light with each movement, a constant reminder of how completely his world had changed. A week ago, he had been just another student boarding the train for his 3rd year. Now, every person in the wizarding world knew his name, his story, and his unprecedented victory in the Wizengamot. He finally found Ron and Hermione in a compartment near the back of the train, their faces lighting up when they saw him. Both of them looked as though they had grown years older in the week since his letters, their expressions carrying a new understanding of the friend they thought they knew. "Harry!" Hermione launched herself from her seat, wrapping him in a fierce hug that spoke of relief, pride, and lingering worry. "We've been reading about everything in the papers. What you did, it was incredible." Ron's greeting was more restrained, but no less warm. "Bloody brilliant, mate. Though I still can't quite believe you took on Dumbledore in front of the entire Wizengamot and won." Harry settled into the seat across from his friends, noting how they both seemed to study him with new eyes, as if searching for visible signs of the transformation they'd read about in the newspapers. "It feels strange," Harry admitted, his voice carrying a maturity that hadn't been there just weeks ago. "Everyone knows who I am now, but not just as the boy who lived. They know me as Lord Black, as someone who actually did something important." "How does it feel?" Hermione asked, her analytical mind clearly working through the implications. "Having that kind of power, I mean. Knowing that when you speak, people have to listen." Harry considered the question carefully. "Terrifying and liberating at the same time. I can actually help people now, but that means I'm responsible when I choose not to act." The train journey continued with a steady stream of visitors to their compartment. Some came to express support, others to satisfy curiosity, and a few to voice disapproval of Harry's challenge to established authority. Through it all, Harry maintained the diplomatic courtesy his crash course in political behavior had taught him, though he could see Ron and Hermione growing more amazed with each interaction. When they finally arrived at Hogwarts, the changes were immediately apparent. The carriages that transported students from the station were no longer pulled by skeletal winged horses invisible to most. With Sirius cleared and no longer a fugitive, there had been no need for Dementors around the school grounds. Instead, the Thestrals were replaced by more traditional horses, creating an atmosphere of normalcy rather than hidden threat. The Great Hall buzzed with excited conversation as students filed in for the welcome feast. But Harry noticed how space seemed to open around him automatically. Students who might once have jostled for seats near the famous Harry Potter now maintained a respectful distance from Lord Black, unsure how to navigate the protocols of interacting with actual nobility. Professor McGonagall was notably absent from the staff table, her usual seat empty beside a man Harry didn't recognize. At the center of the high table, Dumbledore sat with his customary dignity, but Harry could see the subtle signs of his diminished authority, the way other professors no longer automatically deferred to him, the careful distance maintained by ministry representatives who had arrived for the Oversight Committee's first formal review. The sorting proceeded normally until Professor Dumbledore rose to address the school. The usual warm welcome was replaced with something more formal, more constrained. "Welcome to another year at Hogwarts," Dumbledore began, his voice carrying its familiar warmth but lacking some of its former commanding presence. "We have several changes to announce this year. Professor McGonagall has stepped down from her position as head of Gryffindor House to focus on her duties as deputy headmistress. Professor Flitwick has graciously agreed to serve as interim head of Gryffindor while we conduct a formal search for a permanent replacement. Harry felt a pang of sadness at the announcement, though he understood McGonagall's reasoning. Her guilt over her role in his childhood suffering had been genuine, and she was the type of person who required concrete action to address moral failures. Additionally, Dumbledore continued, we welcome Professor Lupin as our new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, and we acknowledge the presence of the Wizengamot Oversight Committee, who will be conducting regular reviews of educational policies and student welfare procedures. The last announcement sent another ripple of whispers through the hall. Never before had external oversight been imposed on Hogwarts, and everyone understood that Harry's actions had made this necessary. After the feast, as Gryffindor students made their way to their common room, Harry found himself walking alongside Professor Lupin. The man was younger than most of the faculty, with prematurely grey hair and a face marked by both intelligence and kindness, but also by something that might have been wariness. Lord Black, Lupin said carefully, his voice carrying a respect that hadn't been there when they'd met briefly on the train platform. I wanted to express my admiration for what you accomplished last week. It took extraordinary courage. Thank you, Professor Lupin, though I hope you won't let my title affect how you teach. I'm still just a third-year student in your class. Lupin smiled, but Harry could see the complexity behind it. I knew your father and Sirius at school, you know. James would have been incredibly proud of the man you're becoming, though I suspect he would have been terrified by your political instincts. Neither he nor Sirius ever had much patience for legal procedures. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment before Lupin spoke again. You should know that your actions have implications beyond what you might realize. The Oversight Committee's reviews will affect how we handle everything from disciplinary procedures to curriculum decisions. Some of the faculty are adjusting to the new reality. Professor Dumbledore seems to be handling it well, Harry observed diplomatically. Albus is a remarkable man who has devoted his life to protecting our world from forces most people can't even imagine, Lupin replied carefully. But remarkable people can make remarkable mistakes, and accountability is necessary even for, especially for, those we most admire. Over the following days, Harry settled into what felt like an entirely new version of Hogwarts life. His classes continued as normal, but his interactions with professors carried a new dynamic. Some, like Professor Flitwick, treated him with the same kindness they always had, while others seemed uncertain how to balance his status as a student with his political authority. It was during his first potions class that Harry fully understood how much his relationship with authority had changed. Professor Snape, who had always seemed to take particular pleasure in humiliating him, approached with his usual sneer, only to stop mid-sentence when Harry looked up from his cauldron with calm confidence rather than the defensive anger Snape was used to provoking. "Something to say, Professor?" Harry asked quietly, his voice carrying none of his old fear, but all of his new political sophistication. Snape studied him for a long moment, clearly recalibrating his approach to someone who was no longer a powerless child, but a lord with demonstrated ability to hold authority figures accountable. "Continue with your brewing, Lord Black," Snape said finally, moving on without his usual cutting remarks. But it was in his dormitory that Harry felt the most significant changes. Neville approached him one evening as Harry was reading letters from various political figures seeking his support for different causes. "Harry," Neville began hesitantly, Could I talk to you about something?" "Privately?" They walked out to the empty common room, where Neville's usual nervousness seemed even more pronounced than usual. "It's about my Gran," Neville said quietly. "She's always been strict, But lately she's been harder, more critical. And after reading about your case, about how adults can hide behind good intentions while hurting children." He trailed off, clearly struggling with the words. Harry felt the weight of his new responsibilities settling on his shoulders. This was what Lupin had meant about implications beyond what he might realize. His victory had given other students courage to speak about their own difficulties, and now they were looking to him for help. "What kind of harder?" Harry asked gently, his voice carrying the careful attention he'd learned from watching Amelia Bones question witnesses. They talked for nearly an hour, with Neville describing a pattern of emotional manipulation and impossible standards that Harry recognized from his own research into abusive dynamics. When they finished, Harry knew exactly what he needed to do. "Neville," he said finally, "would you be comfortable if I had a quiet conversation with Professor Flitwick about resources for students dealing with difficult home situations? Not about specifics, but about policies in general." The relief on Neville's face was answer enough. Over the following weeks, Harry found himself serving as an unofficial advocate for students who had never before felt safe speaking about their problems. His victory over Dumbledore had sent a clear message throughout the wizarding world. Children's welfare mattered, and adults who harmed them would be held accountable. It was exhausting work, requiring diplomatic skills and emotional maturity that most 13-year-olds never needed to develop. But it was also deeply satisfying, giving Harry a sense of purpose that went far beyond academic achievement or Quidditch success. One evening in late September, as Harry sat in the common room reviewing a letter from Sirius about their planned holiday visit, Ron and Hermione settled into chairs beside him. "You're different," Hermione observed, her tone thoughtful rather than critical. "Not just because of the title or the political stuff. You seem more settled, more sure of yourself." Harry looked up from his letter, considering her words. "I suppose I am. For the first time in my life, I know exactly who I am and what I'm capable of. I'm not just reacting to what other people do to me. I'm actively shaping what happens next." "And?" Ron prompted, sensing there was more. "And it's lonely sometimes," Harry admitted. "Power changes how people relate to you, even people who love you. But it's worth it, because it means I can actually help people, instead of just hoping someone else will." That night, as Harry lay in his four-poster bed, listening to his doormate's quiet breathing, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. 3 months ago, he had been a powerless child locked in a cupboard, convinced that his suffering was normal and deserved. Now he was Lord Black, a political figure whose actions had reshaped the entire wizarding world's understanding of justice and accountability. The boy who had lived was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous to those who would abuse their authority. Harry Potter had learned that justice wasn't something granted by the powerful. It was something demanded by those with the courage to fight for it. As sleep finally claimed him, Harry smiled to himself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to use his influence for good, new chances to prove that power wielded responsibly could change the world. The war for truth was won, but the world